Hey everyone, so in today's video, I'm going to be doing a beginner's guide to aquascaping. This video is primarily geared towards people who have never aquascaped before, so I'm going to be just touching on some plants that you might want to choose and certain things that you might want to do to try to make it as smooth as possible. I do have a video of an aquascaping tank tour where I go through all the plants in my tank and I kind of talk about whether or not they're a beginner plant or not, their lighting requirements, and their propagation habits. So I will link that in the iCards and you can check that out if you want to when this video is done. So with that being said, let's get right on to the video. So the first one that I'm going to say is probably a bit of an obvious one, and you're going to want to start off with some beginner plants. Now what a beginner plant is simply one that doesn't require nutrient-rich substrate, it doesn't require a lot of extra fancy nutrients in the water, it doesn't require CO2 injections or anything like that. And it also would mean that it kind of can handle low to moderate lighting, usually on the lower end, so that you don't need any fancy lights or anything like that in order to have them grow. Some examples of beginner plants, and these are a variety of types, is moneywort, hornwort, Java fern, Java moss, Amazon sword, and Anubias. I will get into these plants a little bit more later. The next thing that I'm going to say is that generally you should start small. There's multiple reasons why you should kind of start by only buying a couple plants, and the first one is that if you don't have success with it, you haven't spent a ton of money planting your whole tank only for it to not succeed. Basically, if you try with one or two plants, just having one live one in there as you still have your artificial plants in there, then you can know whether you can keep that alive, and then you can slowly start building up from there. And another thing is, if it is successful, you can slowly propagate that plant, and that one plant will slowly become 2, 3, 4, whatever plants. Another thing you're going to want to note when you're starting with live plants is that you don't really need anything fancy in order to trim or maintain your aquarium. I know you can buy those very expensive aquascaping kits, and they're almost like tool belts. Like, you open those things and they've got tons of different tools of different shapes and sizes and varieties, but you really don't need all that. For example, for me, I just use some precision scissors from a craft store, and I use that to trim my plants. This I just got off my desk, but I do have one specifically for my fish. And I also have a pair of tweezers that are actually for beading, and I just got these from a sewing store. So I just use these for grabbing my plants, and then I use these for cutting them. And these two things together probably only cost me like less than $10 in total. That big expensive kit you don't need to have. Yes, it would be very nice to have, but it is not required. The next thing that I'm going to say, and this has to do with specific type of beginner plants, is I would highly recommend a plant that is non-rooting, as well as any moss plant. Using a plant like this, you don't have to worry about your substrate. They're generally very, very hardy plants. You could either take a plant weight, which is usually made out of lead, you can have some fishing line, or you could use some like brown cotton thread to tie it to something and don't bury it in the substrate. It's probably the most simple plant. The next thing that I'm going to say is that I would recommend buying potted plants first. If you buy a potted plant, it is a particularly larger plant and it already has a full root structure grown. If you buy a plant that is not potted, chances are you're just getting a clipping. These plants can be a little difficult to start growing, especially if you're a beginner. Clipping from a plant that doesn't have any roots yet, trying to get them to grow can be a little bit difficult and requires a little bit more work. So even though it might cost a little bit more to get a bigger potted plant, overall, your money will go further because you have more success keeping it alive. The next thing that I'm going to mention is something I kind of touched on a little bit in the beginning. If you're dosing with nutrients, you don't need to jump immediately into CO2. That is very expensive, and there's certainly a knack to it. If you're just a novice, you certainly don't need to add all that to your life. You don't need to add any like separate nutrients. Like, for example, I'll just show you mine right here. You can either get something that is specific to a specific nutrient. For example, this is Flourish Iron. I'm not sure if it's going to focus. And then you're also going to find just something like this, which is generic. Just like has all the trace elements in it. And this one I add to my tank about every 3 days or so. And the last kind of nutrients that you can have, those are both liquid, and this of course is excluding like soil that has nutrients in it, is something known as a root tab. Root tabs are added to your aquarium about every couple of months usually, depending on what kind it is, but it is just a little root tab, and I'll pull one out for you guys to kind of see what it looks like. So it's just like a little brown cube that you just kind of bury in your substrate, and it will really help give nutrients to rooted plants if you don't have a heavily nutrient substrate. Just keep in mind that when you start off, there might be some algae growth in your aquarium. There might be a little bit more than you're used to. Now, you want your plants to grow, but you don't want algae to grow in your tank. So you'll really have to make sure that you're good with applying the nutrients, that you put exactly how much you need for the amount of plants in your tank, which will be a little bit of trial and error. Now, the next thing that I will say is that you really want to know the kind of fish that are in your aquarium. Now, you might think that all fish can go well with planted tanks, and this is kind of the case, but there are certain plants that don't get along with certain fish. If you have a fish that likes to eat plants, they will destroy them. Some of them will actually rip them out of the substrate, and some of them will just be rough with them and they'll end up kind of falling apart if it's a more brittle plant. So you really want to know what kind of fish you have in your tank before you go ahead and buy certain plants for it. So if you have a very aggressive fish that likes to attack plants, I would highly recommend getting a very sturdy plant such as Anubias, which has very thick, sturdy leaves and will be able to withstand a lot of like tugging and pulling by fish. And you're also going to want maybe a plant that has a very, very heavy root structure, such as an Amazon sword. That one will be very hard for a fish to pull out. I personally do not have experiences with very nippy fish, but I will put a few on the screen right here of some fish that are generally a little bit more aggressive towards plants. One thing that you're going to want to keep in mind that you might not be familiar with is melting. If your plant starts to dissolve away, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's dying. It could just mean that it is melting. And all of a sudden, all the leaves just melt away. They just start to look wet, they droop, and then they completely disappear. There is a chance it's dead, but chances are it is something that has melted. Generally, this doesn't happen with any of the beginner plants that I mentioned, just because I try to steer beginners away from these kind of plants due to this reason. But if you are having a plant such as a Vallisneria, a Sagittaria plant, or any kind of crypt, those ones when you first plant them, the change in water from the store to your tank will generally cause them to be in shock and they will melt. This basically happens, the leaves will melt away, but the roots are still growing, and then eventually they'll start to grow back, and they'll grow back looking nice. I have had Vallisneria, I've had Sagittaria, and I've had crypts in my tank. They've all melted, and most of them have come back perfectly fine. Even though they do look ugly when they're melted, I would definitely recommend keeping the leaves on there for as long as you can stand them, because even when they do look kind of unsightly, they do still get their nutrients from the leaves, so it's a good idea to keep them on there as long as possible, at least until you start to see some new growth. So that is what I recommend. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention is less of a tip and more of a word of advice. And the first thing that I'm going to say is, if you don't succeed with a certain plant, you shouldn't automatically write off all plants. If you try something and it doesn't seem to work out, you can't really make it grow, there might be another plant that's a little bit more successful for you. Because plants are slightly different and they all have slightly different requirements, even though it is a beginner plant, there might just be that one thing in your tank that, for whatever reason, your plant doesn't like. I have had some plants in here that I don't have in here anymore because I haven't been able to keep them alive. But as you can see, there are definitely some plants that are thriving in my aquarium. You don't automatically have to assume that because one plant didn't succeed, even if it was a beginner plant, that you're not good at live planting. That is my word of advice to you to send you off. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you learned something. If you're a fish keeper who's currently using live plants and you feel I missed something in this video, then make sure you leave a tip or trick in the comments down below so that other fish keepers can see it. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, then make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get notified when I upload. But that's all for today, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye guys!